that was really the breakthrough for me, thinking about, okay, here's a person who just embodies the very best of what humans can aspire to. And if we just allow him to do that on the page, if we allow him to embody those qualities, I think it's almost provocative, especially in the world we're in now. And I think what James Gunn is saying in his movie is that it is genuinely provocative to present basically a kind person who wants to help and who will get himself beaten up and knocked around, but he never gives up. He will never let you down. And he always there to help. And so to me, yes, it's a fantasy, but it's a great fantasy, and it's one that is worth aspiring to.
Hi guys, I'm Billy, and welcome back to Half the Picture podcast. Our guest this episode is none other than Grant Morrison, one of the most legendary writers to ever work in comics, and who's written some of the greatest comics of the last 40 years, including, oh my God, Batman Arkham Asylum, JLA, We3, Batman R.I.P., The Invisibles, Doom Patrol, Final Crisis. There are so many. Although they came on the podcast primarily to talk about All-Star Superman, their comic of Frank Quitely, which, since it came out 20 years ago, has become revered as one of the greatest Superman comics, if not one of the greatest comics of all time. It was a huge influence on James Gunn's Superman and a big inspiration for his direction and take on the Man of Steel. Look, guys, Grant's been one of my favorite writers since I was a kid, since I first picked up Arkham Asylum when I was 13, and I cannot wait to share this conversation with you. We started talking about Superman, but then we span off into all these strange and weird and wonderful areas. If you're a fan of Grant's, you'll know just how strange and wonderful their career really is. All the stories they've accumulated over the years, and obviously all the great comics they've written as well. So, we really got into it, but we got into it so much that we actually had to split this episode into two parts because we just went on for so long. So part 2 will be coming down the line soon, but without further ado, let's roll on part 1 of my conversation with Grant Morrison. Enjoy. Hi, Grant. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Billy. How you doing? Thanks a lot for the intro. That was very appealing.
My pleasure. My pleasure. So today, as I was saying before we hit record, today is the day of, I guess you could call it Superman Day. Today's the release of James Gunn's new Superman movie. It's the birth of a new DC universe on screen. It's it's a new phase, and you Superman is a character that you've been sort of tied to for years. You've written what is held up to be arguably the definitive sort of take on Superman's story of Superman. All-Star Superman is the name of it, which you wrote 20 years ago now. It's been 20 years since that started. Can you believe it?
Yeah, it's hard to believe, but it has been 20 years. People have lived and died in that time. Dynasties have risen and fallen, but yeah. It's funny. It takes things 20 years, I think, to go from the comic page to the screen. It's very typical, because people were doing Frank Miller's Dark Knight like 20 years after the comic, or they're doing Watchmen 25 years later. So they kind of had this weird lag time where they catch up with us 20 years after we've been past that long ago.
So talking about Superman, I guess, start there, because I guess all of superhero culture and comics and films, the story, it all comes back to Superman. So because you've written Superman in various different versions and guises. You worked on the New 52 Superman Action Comics, you rebooted Superman for like a new age with the New 52. You wrote him in JLA when he had the mullet, which he picked up at Hell, I think was the idea.
Yeah, I think so.
He had the mullet. And then came All-Star Superman right in the middle of that in 2005. You and Frank Quitely, your friend and artistic collaborator, created that story. And I guess just going back to the beginning, where did that story come from? Where did that particular take of Superman come from?
Well, it was after the JLA stuff where I've been doing Superman in JLA, and I started to get a feel for what was possible with that character. And as you say, he's the original superhero. He's the progenitor of all these things that we've been watching on the movies for the last 25 years. So he is kind of important, and I was fascinated by the creation of the character, because there hadn't been anything like him before that. There had been Americans had heroes who were, say, gangsters or cowboys, or they even had inventors like Tom Swift or Frank Reed, who appeared in pulp magazines back in the day. But Superman was something completely new, and there was so many great ideas went into it. The notion that he had his monogram on his chest, was very new. They had the sign right there, so that he was instantly recognizable from a distance. The same with the primary colors, the red and the blue, and what I discovered, most people think of Superman, they're so used to the costume, they don't really think about where it came from. But looking back at the creation of it, the costume was based on circus strongman outfits. So that's why he wears those weird trunks over his tights. You know, it's no one could ever understand why he's got a belt and trunks over a pair of tights. But it was to recreate the look of circus strongmen, and they also wore the capes as well for a bit more drama. So it was very much he was based on that, but then he had this huge initial, and the cape allowed the figure to be very dynamic. So when he was drawn, he was constantly moving, and the cape allowed that kind of motion to be depicted in the comic. So there was a lot of really great ideas went into the creation of the character, and going back to the root of that, I got very excited about understanding what could be done with something like that, you know, because to me it was a cartoon embodiment of humans' greatest idea, which is quite simply that we can be better. You know, and it goes back to, for me, to humanist thinking, you know, back in the Renaissance in Italy when Pico della Mirandola was doing his oratorio on human dignity. And he talks about this. He's saying, you know, humans, what we are is what we're really good at is imitating things. That's our greatest skill. You know, if we see a bird, we can eventually invent airplanes. We see fish, we invent submarines. We copy all the time. And so his thesis was basically, if humans are such copycats, why don't we only copy the finest creatures that we can imagine? So he talked about angels. We should aim towards the quality of the angels, because those were regarded as the most sublime beings, you know, at the time in religion. But for us, it's kind of the superhero or that kind of special person. So I was fascinated with this idea. It was a humanist idea from a long, long time ago that had found this new reflection in a very strange place. You know, it was in children's comics that were created in 1938 for children, illiterates, and servicemen. You know, that's what those comics were created for in the first place. But what they did was give a home to this vision of what we could be. And although it's cartoonish, although it's kind of silly and it's for kids, there's something beautiful about it. And I really felt I connected to that notion of presenting what's the best of us, who is the best of us, what would he be like? And that idea of, you know, Superman not only has super strength and super speed and super invulnerability and damage resistance, I figure he's also got super intelligence. You know, in the 60s comics, there was a great play on the fact that Superman is also an inventor and that he's very smart. So I love the idea he'd get super intelligence. Then I'm thinking, well, he'd have super all the qualities, you know, he'd have super kindness, super compassion. And that was really the breakthrough for me, thinking about, okay, here's a person who just embodies the very best of what humans can aspire to. And if we just allow him to do that on the page, if we allow him to embody those qualities, I think it's almost provocative, you know, especially in the world we're in now. And I think what James Gunn is saying in his movie is that it is genuinely provocative to present basically a kind person who wants to help and who will get himself beaten up and knocked around, but he never gives up. He will never let you down. And he always there to help. And so to me, yes, it's a fantasy, but it's a great fantasy, and it's one that is worth aspiring to. So I really felt that if I could embody that in my work in the same way that I think James felt could embody that in the movie, then we'd be breaking some kind of ground. We'd be giving people a kind of aspirational figure that I think is quite needed at this time in history.
Absolutely, and I think the key word there is it is provocative, because in a way, in this day and age, in this sort of very sort of scientific, rational, enlightened sort of 21st century that we live in the West anyway, at least, but I think sort of globally now, it is like optimism almost does seem like a kind of revolutionary act or a provocative act. You know, just putting your sort of planting the flag down in sort of the land of optimism, and sort of an action. And I mean, that's the other thing I remember you saying about Superman, that, like, you know, because Superman always, for a lot of people, seems to embody hope. But then I remember you saying, like, it is hope, but it is also action. It's not a sort of abstract sort of concept of hope. It's like he gets, you know, shit done. Because I remember what you were saying, and which I think is also I think it sounds like the thing that James in his film is sort of focusing in on, is that this is a guy, who's constantly in action, and like you were saying, he's in motion, he's moving constantly.
Yeah, I think that's a very important aspect of Superman, you know, is that people do talk about Superman as a symbol of hope, but as I've said, you know, so hope is quite abstract, and everyone can hope, but hope isn't enough. You know, there has to be action. Someone, it has to be us or someone else, generally has to do something if we want things to change. And to me, that's the most important thing about Superman. Is, as I say, he's a scrapper, he's a fighter. He's not a messianic figure as he's sometimes presented. You know, there's a lot of images of Superman where he's hanging in space and the sun is behind him and he's kind of meant to be kind of Christ-like or godlike, but that's not Superman. Superman is just this young person who happens to have all this power and this particular attitude. And so I think it's important to see him getting in there, getting his ripped up, his clothes ripped up, his face beaten about, but always getting back up and always fighting the good fight. And that's the important thing is the action aspect, the scrapper aspect, the fact that this guy will just keep taking on the bad guys and keep taking on the bullies, whatever it costs him. And again, it's a fantastic, fantastic, unreal figure, but worth trying to live up to.
Absolutely. And focusing on that for a moment, because I remember, so in your book, Supergods, which we've mentioned, you talk a lot about the sort of superhuman, superheroic ideal sort of embodied in Superman, and how writing All-Star Superman specifically was almost, the story of which sort of details these legendary labors that Superman accomplishes over the last sort of days of his life. For anyone who hasn't read it, Lex Luthor essentially sort of causes Superman to fly too close to our sun, and his cells get supercharged with solar radiation, and this cell death starts occurring, and he then realizes he has only so much time left, and so he starts to accomplishing all these heroic labors and 12 labors of Superman. And you described writing this story and writing Superman almost like the phrase you're using was like a monk contemplating the deeds of a saint, and also you said, I remember you said you felt elevated and kind of like by sort of just contemplating like what would Superman, like you say, he's super creative, he's super compassionate, he's super strong in every single sense of the word. So like how would that make you feel as a writer? And I guess like what was that like? And did you, I guess, seeing things how Superman sees them, did you then sort of take that with you after All-Star Superman? Did you move that into your life and into like your work in a sort of more broad sense?
Yeah, I mean, certainly as much as I felt I could, I'm not a fighter like Superman. I was raised as a pacifist by a soldier dad. So I've never been someone who likes getting into fights, although I've been in fights. So I generally try to solve things without fists. So I'm not like Superman in that way, but certainly writing the book was, it was like Buddhist meditation almost. It was very much having to put yourself in the mind of someone who doesn't think like a human being, whose thoughts are purer and more exalted and more direct and just more to the point. So that aspect of it really changed how I thought, and it did kind of push me into position. I mean, round here, my version of Superman is looking after like 40 feral cats. So I'm kind of have to make sure they're okay. Like today, I have to go and get one cat some medicine because he's sick. I have to look after some kittens that have been born. So for me, there's that sense of responsibility that I feel is kind of Supermanian, let's call it, And so certainly things like that where you just feel those are things that you do because you say to yourself, well, this is the right thing to do. I don't really want to have to do this twice a day and have to feed 40 cats. I don't want to have to look after 40 animals. But it's the right thing to do if they're living in the space around your house. So stuff like that where it just became really obvious from Superman's perspective, like what you do, and you sacrifice a certain extent to do these things in order to be there for other creatures or other people. So yeah, I mean, it really affected me in that way, and my sense of responsibility went through the roof, which wasn't necessarily great for mental health, but we try our best. We try our best in the name of Superman.
Oh yeah. So it's touching on animals there, because you mentioned that because I know you've been an animal lover all your life, right? You've been sort of I know you're a great cat lover. I know you've had, there are pictures of you of like going back to the 80s, like your cat on your shoulder and stuff and all this stuff. Yeah, and obviously I think like We3, which I know which is one of your comics, which you did with Frank Whiteley, who was the artist on All Star Superman, was a really big that almost feels like a love letter, not just to sort of animals, but also to humans and the relationships we have with the world around us and the creatures around us, and how that reflects back who we are. And linking that to James Gunn, the director, I know for a long time he really wants to get a film of We3 off the ground. Is that right? He was really trying to.
Yeah, he did. It was kind of his favorite comic, and he wanted to do it. And to be honest, he kind of did it in Guardians of the Galaxy 3. He kind of picked our pockets a little bit there, but God bless him. But yeah, he wanted to do that, and he's a big animal lover, as you can see. Krypto's in the Superman movie, and he's got Eagly in the Peacemaker show. So James is always trying to sneak super animals into things as well. Like me. You know, if I can get Streaky the Super Cat into a story, I'll do it. You know, if I can get Super Horse or Super Monkey or any of those ridiculous things. Yeah, I was always really fond of the animal characters. And I think you're right when you say that how people treat animals is kind of, it's kind of says everything about them. So yeah, I think to take again, going back to that Superman morality, it's a lot about how you would treat animals. How would Superman treat animals? Well, he'd make sure they all had food. You know, he would take a little bit of time out of his patrol to put some kibble down. So there is that. I think it's very important to see what people think about animals, to get the measure of how they would help other people as well.
I was going to say that, yeah, because I think in many ways, just touching on, you mentioned Guardians of the Galaxy 3. I mean, I remember watching it this summer and thinking, and knowing what I knew about how he tried to get We3 made for so long, I was like, yeah, this is like the imagery is exactly sort of like Rocket Raccoon in the pen with all the animals and stuff. I mean, what was your reaction seeing that when you saw that film?
I'm just like kind of deja vu. No, that was it. That was it. That says it all. Deja vu.
Well, it was a similar experience. Think you have a similar experience with The Matrix, because obviously The Matrix owes so much to your series from the 90s, The Invisibles, about the sort of countercultural rebels sort of, you know, trying to overthrow the sort of...
Yeah, and as I mean, The Matrix was very specific, you know, because The Invisibles had kung fu people wearing leather, fetish stuff, and round mirror shades, and they were up against insect agents who wore black and who turned into armored beings from beyond, and there was jumps from the top of a building, and there was magic mirror coming out of the mirror and covering people. So there was a lot of stuff in there. But again, I loved The Matrix. I went to see it in Australia. And as I said, I just sat there kind of like, okay, deja vu, deja vu. And it was like, I felt kind of like, this is bad because The Invisibles will never get made. But at the same time, The Matrix is just a great movie, you know. It's just, I don't like the sequels quite as much. I thought that they kind of let it down a bit. But that first movie is just a brilliant movie from start to end, I think. So I was quite happy that those ideas were getting out to a much more wider mainstream world.
Yeah, those kind of Gnostic, very esoteric ideas. And it's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, linking it back.
and clearly they were appealing. You know, I mean, people really loved that. So it was validating in the sense that I knew those ideas would be appealing, but also they've been quite oddly turned and twisted over the last 25 years as well. So you'll find right-wing QAnon people saying things that once left-wing invisibles people used to say in the 90s, conspiracy stuff and that kind of counterculture stuff got almost twisted into its own dark reflection. So it's been interesting to watch that process.
Totally. It's almost like the whole red pill, blue pill, that whole rhetoric is just it's been co-opted, and it's so bizarre. It's like you said at the start, like those 20-year cycles, we don't really know how something's going to last until 20 years. And The Matrix really has, you know, I think it was always a phenomenon in its own way, but like then really, I think people my age and a bit older, grown up and now come of age, it's like, you know, people just love it. Yeah. And also your images touching again on cinema, like because so many of your characters and sort of your comics have influenced so much, if not directly, if sort of so many of your characters have cropped up in you know, superhero and blockbuster cinema for the last 20 years. I mean, like even in Wolverine, Deadpool and Wolverine last year, Cassandra Nova's the main baddie, really, and she was born in your pages of your new X-Men, you know, which is an incredible comic, by the way, just to say.
Well, thank you, thanks. But yeah, I mean that is what happens, and it is a bit strange for me. I think it must happen to all of us, you know, that sense of if you've been around long enough, your work percolates into culture, and you suddenly see it coming back. You know, I'll watch a Doctor Who and I think, oh, Russell Davis has read that Alan Moore comic, or he's read that comic by me, and there it is. You know, and I'll see films, and there's a ton of things. Stranger Things will have a little bit of Invisibles in it. There'll be characters, like you say, will crop up that you created 20 years ago. So it's an odd thing to influence pop culture. And for people who read my stuff in the 90s to have grown up enough to put it into their own movies or into their own comics or into their own artwork. And part of it is, as I say, it's lovely, it's validating, it's nice to have made some kind of impact. But at the same time, it's really, you know, I've seen it all before. When that happens, it's, oh God, I've already done this. I've already read this, you know. So that's what I feel a bit sad about. It's I don't have the pop culture that I used to, where it wasn't influenced by me or by people that I know from comics. So there's all these weird strands now that I'm too familiar with. Like back in the day, it was great because there was no pop culture influenced by me, and I could just be influenced by all the pop culture. So,
Aye. Well, I mean, we'll come back to that because I want to talk about some of your influences in a bit. But touching back on All-Star Superman, when I was rereading it for this interview, I mean, the fascinating thing to me about that story, which, as I say, has been sort of is now held up as one of, if not the sort of quintessential Superman stories, and James has talked about it a lot in relation to the Hoop. I mean, there are promotional images from the film which directly quote panels from the comic. I mean, Superman and Krypto, that quad poster, that is literally a panel from All-Star issue 6, the Smallville issue with Superman and Superboy and Krypto on the moon. But when I was rereading the comic, there was very little in the comic that, and I hadn't realized this before, but like there's very little that ties it to the period in which you guys created it. So the mid-noughties, which like, I mean, I'm 29, so I grew up in that was the decade in which I sort of was a kid and was reading a lot of comics. And the prevailing tone I remember from comics was, I'm sure you'll identify this, but it was like very, it was post 9/11, so post 9/11 politics.
Absolutely, yeah.
Really realism. The artists were people like, Brian Hitch, like that super widescreen, cinematic, proscenium, flashy comic art, which was the aesthetic of it was very, like a blockbuster and very different to the kind of style and direction you and Frank went in, Vincent, the artist, went in for All-Star Superman, which was much more sort of explicitly to me like comic book. Like there was a lot of Will Eisner in there, and in the way that the characters were like hunched and the way they moved, and the fact, and also the absence of pop culture references. There's virtually like no pop culture references in that comic, which there's nothing in it that's and it feels timeless. I think this contributes to its sort of transcendent quality that for me it had reading it. And I was thinking like, was that something that was very explicitly in the DNA from the beginning? Like you and Frank talked like, we don't want to go in the direction that everyone else is going in. We want to react against that and go against the grain and do something that is separate from that. Was that something that you guys were conscious of when making it?
Yeah, it was very much that, and as you say, the comics that were out at the time, it was very interesting because they had borrowed all that language from cinema. So there was great, like the Ultimates and the stuff Brian Bendis was doing in Spider-Man, but it was borrowed from the language of cinema. So you had what was called decompression, which is basically people writing screenplay style comic books where Stan Lee told the origin of Spider-Man in 13 pages, and it took Brian Bendis 6 issues of 20 pages each to tell the same story. So it was very much a different approach. And as you say, even the artwork was done, it was done on black backgrounds so that the panels actually looked like cinema screens, as if you were in a theater and surrounded by, it was blackness with the light projected purely into the panels. So we were aware of all that. And when we did We3, which was the first thing we did after those types of comics, it was very much being influenced by video editing techniques rather than cinema. So we thought like multiple chopped up panels and lots of small images and a different playing around with time. So we were really thinking about what's the difference between video editing and film editing, and let's do that. And by the time All-Star Superman came around, the idea was definitely, we thought, let's just do classical. Let's do something, again, based on that Renaissance idea and the Enlightenment man, that sort of notion of, we wanted it to be very ordered and classical and none of the craziness that we'd put into We3, for instance. And I took out a lot of the non-linear or the psychedelic stuff that I usually like to put in stories. And we made it very much that simple, 4 square, very easy to read panels. There's only a certain amount of words in all the panels. You'll notice there's not a lot of times where people do big, long monologues or speeches that take up space. So it's very easy to read, I think. And that was part of as you say, the attempt to do something timeless. We just thought, if we're going to do Superman, it's the greatest superhero. I've kind of reached a point in my career where I thought, I'm at the peak now, so let's write a story about how it feels to be at the peak, but then suddenly it all goes away because he's dying. So there was a lot of influences that I felt went into that, and very much like, let's do this classical thing that could be read forever, that your grandmother could read and enjoy it, and a kid could read and enjoy it, and a chimpanzee could read and enjoy it. It was very much intended to be timeless and universal, and I think that, that's been borne out by the fact that people are still talking about it now, and still, as you say, reading it, and it doesn't have those connections. If you read an issue of the Ultimates now, it's wild because there's all these references to Shannon Elizabeth or
Prince Junior and the
yeah, Freddie Prinze Jr. And you're kind of lost without a concordance with that, and it's fascinating. It's like my Zenith stuff from the 80s and 2000 AD, where if you read that now, and he's talking about Network 7 and Magenta Divine and all these weird like 1980s pop culture reference points. So I think there's room for that type of work as well as a time capsule of a period. But as I say, and as you point out, All Star Superman was very much designed to be the Bible for Superman, the immortal work, the one that will survive it. It's probably the only thing of mine that will survive into the next few generations, I think.
Oh, I mean, you said. I mean, I humbly disagree because there's so many, great comics of yours that that I mean, and I love, and I know many other people love, like Arkham Asylum and New X-Men and We3 and yeah. So I'm sure that's not true, but
well, thanks, Billy.
time will tell. Time will tell.
Time will indeed tell. I think they'll be digging All Star Superman out of the rubble of Washington, restarting society.
I mean, I guess we've got to, as we're on Superman, we've got to touch on the movie. I mean, like we were saying, like you and James Gunn have been friends, it seems, for decades at this point, right? I mean, you guys go back.
No, not decades. I mean, I met James, I think, around about the time Super came out, so maybe 2009 or thereabouts. But yeah, I've known him since then, and obviously we hung about a bit when I was spending a lot more time in Hollywood. Yeah, I mean, I've been following his career, and I'm very keen to see this. I haven't seen the film yet, obviously, but I'm really excited to see it. I feel as if he's been eager to do this for a long time.
Well, I remember they offered it to him when he sort of first moved to DC, and then he did Suicide Squad instead. And then he said, "No, but I'll stick a pin in that. I'll jump on Superman in a few years." But yeah, I mean, I'm planning to go see it over the weekend. I can't wait. Have you got a date lined up yet for when you'll?
Not yet. We might see it this weekend, but not sure. It'll be within days, I reckon. Because I don't normally go to movies. I tend to wait till I can get them on TV. But I'll definitely go and see this one. I think it's worth seeing on IMAX.
Yeah. And I mean, because it was interesting to me is that cause I know that you've consulted with DC on sort of film projects before, in the past for years. I mean, I know going back to the noughties, you were one of the guys from DC that I think was it Warner Brothers brought in to sort of pitch ideas for Wonder Woman and Green Lantern.
Absolutely. It was me and Jeff Johns and Marv Wolfman, who was there as sort of older generation of DC creators. And he asked us to pitch for a ton of things, I did 3 separate pitches for Superman. I did like 3 different ones for Aquaman. I did Wonder Woman. I did a whole bunch, Teen Titans. Honestly, it was a ton of them. So we were doing a lot of work at that time, and they paid us a lot of money, but nothing was produced, nothing was made. If they'd made my Superman film back then, that would have been the one. But
I was gonna ask that Wonder Woman pitch. Did it have any of the themes that the original Marston, bondage imagery themes that were?
It was kind of material that I then used for the Wonder Woman Earth 1 book, which has turned out to be fairly controversial, but it was kind of based on that. The basic story of that with the Ares robot suits and Maxwell Lord is that was the main story in it. But nah, they didn't take on any of our things. They read everything and then said, "No, do another one. No, do another one." So there's all these beautifully worked out pitches for different versions of Superman movies and Aquaman movies. I wish I could find them again, but I think they got lost in a computer actually.
Well, I was going to say, as a sort of consultant for DC for a long time, I know that sort of even actors have turned to you for inspiration. I mean, like Jared Leto, I heard was when he was putting together his take on the Joker, and Ezra Miller, even I think got in touch, I want to say, for the Flash.
Ezra Miller hung out with us, in fact, before all the controversy that surrounded Ezra. And honestly, we didn't get any of that from the kid. He was, I really liked him, the person that I met, but he wrote a Flash script with me, and I've kind of honestly, he provided an explosion onto paper, and then I had to take it and turn it into a story. But it was pretty good. I think that the script was written in 2 weeks because they were just on our backs the whole time. So it was a kind of ridiculous pace, but there's a lot of really great stuff in it. I think if it'd been given a couple more polishes, it would have actually been genuinely brilliant. But again, they didn't want to go that route, and they certainly didn't want to use me. They've always been strange with me, even though I've worked with them for so long. They don't like the comic book guys getting too near the stuff. They've got a weird fetish about it.
I guess it is kind of the number of instances of like comic writers genuinely sort of being able to bridge that gap. There are too many, and I guess because they are such two different mediums. I mean, but you have written for screen. You developed Tactic Television and Brave New World, and like I say, so many of your ideas come through on in so many different films. I mean, do you find that they're two different disciplines when you're writing a comic and obviously writing a script? They've got to be, so, and getting that script made, it must be such a different catch.
I think the main difference is just simply that movies cost an awful lot of money and comics don't. So with a comic, you can experiment more, you can try things, and comics come out fast. They come out one every month. So you're writing 20 pages every month of a character's adventures. So sometimes you can do 20 pages where he's just in a psychedelic nightmare. Sometimes you can do 20 pages where that character, she's just sitting in a throne for 20 pages. You couldn't really get away with that in movies. And also you can't go as wild and extravagant with your imagination as you might in a comic book, because if you've got a good artist, they can draw pretty much anything. But if it's on a movie, they're going to have to spend a lot of money on CGI or AI or whatever they're using now. So the big thing I found was that the control on movies is so much more powerful because there's a lot of money people involved and they can't risk the failure. So where comics is like poetry, comics is like being an auteur. You just get to do your thing. And there's not a lot of heavy editing. I mean, it might be for other people, but I was menacing enough that they didn't give me a hard time. So I kind of, when I wrote a comic, it was what I wrote. Whatever I wrote came out. And if I was sick that month, you could tell. Or if I was bored, you could tell. I mean, genuinely didn't write things when I was bored, but usually you can tell if I'm happy or sad. So there's like I say, it's more like poetry. It's more of an auteur thing. It's just that you're being allowed to be very individual. In a movie, it's more like a TV show. It's a team game. You're in a football team, and you have to flatten your ego, and you have to be working with people, and you have to know when to sit back and listen to someone else's ideas and all that. So I found it fascinating. I'm working on a show just now. It's that NDA thing. I just love almost the anonymity of it. Comics, it's like there's such a focus on you, and you're the superstar, you're the singer, and it can become a bit kind of wearing. So I enjoy the flipping between them and doing that kind of a more collective work, where if I have an off day, then somebody else will have a great idea and I don't have to worry about it.
Totally. I mean, it's interesting because I remember something that Frank Whiteley, or Vincent is your name, said in the documentary about him. What do I do all day? He said, when you're in comics, that you're a big cog in a sort of fairly sort of small compact machine. If you're an artist or a writer, it's really like it's a small team, and you're on, and like you say, you're kind of on display. Your vision kind of gets out there. Whereas on a film set or a television set, or even in like sort of, he was talking about magazine illustration and stuff.
Yeah,
you're a much smaller cog in a bigger machine. But I guess that's part of the fear, but also the joy of comics. Like you say, you're on a stage, but it's your stage.
Yeah, and it's nice that it's like pop music. It's like being a singer. It's like suddenly your record's done well, and suddenly you get an album out, and everybody likes you. What's the next single? What's the next one? And you're going to hit the backlash at some point. And like me, if you keep going through decades, you go through backlashes and revivals and backlashes so fast that it just seems like waves on the ocean. So yeah, I mean that it is fun for that. But like I say, it's nice to go back and forward and to do different types of work and not to have that same pressure and that intensity of if you put a foot wrong, the fans are on your back. If something goes wrong in a film, you're rarely blamed for it. Someone else will get the blame.
Totally. So touching once more briefly on the Superman movie, because as I say, you were a consultant for DC for many years, and like Jared Leto and Ezra Miller, inspiration. I mean, and James has obviously been a fan of yours for a long time, and you guys are friends. I mean, did he ever and obviously also Superman was kind of in the back of his movie. I mean, did he ever talk to you about the movie? Did he ever talk to you about the character? Did you ever get to visit the set? Because I know Frank did visit the set with a bunch of the other DC artists.
Yeah. No, I was invited on that, but I wasn't able to go to that. But yeah, I was invited to that. But otherwise, no, James didn't really talk to me about it because honestly, I think he wanted to just have his own take. And although he was influenced by elements of All-Star Superman, and I think possibly even more influenced by elements of Action Comics, because my Action Comics Superman is much younger and much brasher and much more of a fighter and a scrapper. The older Superman that we do is kind of stoic and kind of internalized character, but you don't see him. He doesn't hit many people in it at all. He uses his strength and he uses his powers, but he rarely hits anyone. Whereas the young Superman runs about getting into fights constantly, and so I think that element was there. But other than that, I don't think it would have been good to have me as a sounding board, because it would become more of my Superman. I think he'd seen what I had to say, and he took what he wanted from that, and then had to create something that suited him. So no, I mean, I wasn't involved in any of the background or the development of it.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, it's interesting something that you said in the previous question, which was that like with comics, you kind of get to do your thing, by the sounds of it, more or less, and then whereas in movies, so yeah, it's much more. You're part of a team, a football team, as you say. It's like, and I feel like there's a lot more oversight in that in media, in film and television. That comics, and this is just my understanding, but I mean, I could be completely off it, but like it seems to me that like comics, for a long time, obviously for many decades, they were seen as a pretty, like we said at the very beginning, kind of for children, or sort of quite a cheap basic form of sort of literature or entertainment. And then obviously over the years with yourself and writers like Alan Moore and Frank Miller, like creating all this incredible work like Watchmen and putting comics, giving them that sort of respectability, and graphic novels became a term, and like even though I've always preferred just comics, but like
comics is what they are. I mean, graphic novels was a kind of late comer, and it doesn't quite describe them, I don't think.
Totally, no, it is what it is. It's a comic book, but it still seems to me, and like I said, I could be completely off here, but that there's a certain amount of there's a less oversight in sort of the development of comics, and I feel like maybe more you can get as a writer or creator, you can get away with more things, for better or worse, maybe. And because it's a visual medium now, and you're using pen and ink rather than celluloid, you can still book things on a page visually that are pretty out there and pretty inspiring or shocking or taboo busting. I remember thinking this when I was reading Alan Moore's, I know it's a contemporary of yours, when he was doing Lost Girls. Yeah. And actually, I don't know if you've read, I don't know if you're familiar with Lost Girls.
I'm familiar with it, but I haven't read it.
Well, there's some pretty.
I know all about it.
Yeah, it's pretty full on, and basically, an erotic, a piece of erotic literature or pornography, as he called it, in comic book form. And there's some pretty, out there things in there, acts in there, which you think if this was, I mean, if this was on a screen, you wouldn't be able to. It just get that idea would never have got past the pitching stage, for that particular chapter or that scene. But because it's a comic, and because obviously, if in the case of Alan Moore, he has cachet. Yeah, his name is cachet. You're able to sort of get things out there. I guess my point is that, like in comics, do you feel like there's a sort of less, because there's less oversight? Maybe because some people still view them, like publishers still view them as, they're just comics. You can get away with stuff that is a bit more experimental, a bit more taboo busting, a bit more out there. Is that? Do you think there's any truth to that?
I think that's definitely true. Although, I mean, I grew up with kind of auteur cinema, and I was always interested in world cinema and things. So for me, cinema and also BBC television, like in the days of Dennis Potter and people like David Rudkin, who were big influences, provided that kind of the taboo busting. They were using a popular medium to say things that we don't normally hear. But certainly comics, I mean, a lot of people think of comics as barely culturally above the level of toilet graffiti. So we can get away with a lot of stuff, they're considered sensationalist and crude anyway. And sometimes the drawings aren't even that great, but there's something magical about the way it works. And, the idea is obviously that comics engage the alleged right and left hemispheres of the brain. There's this whole theory that with pictures and words together, so you're getting this holographic effect that you don't get from any other type of art. And I also think the interesting thing about comics is that they're tactile. The relationship we have with them is very intimate, and it's not like cinema. And cinema, you're sitting in a darkened room, and the director is in control of what you see and experience for 2 hours or 3 hours, or like these days, 3.5 hours. But in the same television is different. Television is like another person in the room, just like a granddad babbling in the corner. You either pay attention or you don't. But with comics, there's a very intimate connection between the reader and the creators. And you're holding it and you're turning it, and your pace is in control. So it's very different the way people interact with a comic. And I think that gives them their very odd quality. And it's again, I'd use the word fetishistic in its basic sense, not necessarily in a sexual sense, but in the sense of the comic has a totem quality. You know, it's the way you interact with it and the things that it tells you activate in the brain in very interesting ways, and they become real. I mean, these ghastly drawings, sometimes really badly drawn, octagonal mouths, but you're buying into it and you're crying because this character's upset. So I think there's a great magic in that, you know, like sort of. And some of them, I'm talking about bad drawings. A lot of the drawings are fabulous, as you know. You get Frank Quitely or an Alex Ross or any of these great guys. But even when the drawings are crude, like they are in a lot of the early Marvel comics, the stories can still move us, can still make us feel things. And I find that fascinating, just with ink on paper and the way we interact with it, that we can create these holographic universes that we really immerse ourselves in and become part of and feel from. So I think that's what comics have got. An intense totemistic, you know, almost magical power. That's what gives them their odd flavor, and no other medium has that in the same way. It doesn't have that same interactive quality. So that's why that brings me back to them. Certainly, it's like they have a genuinely magical feeling, and I love being able to put ideas through them. But yeah, I mean, like I say, they've always been considered as slightly disreputable. So it means you can explore not only, you know, highfalutin philosophy, you can just explore crude imagery and the most ridiculous things, you know, like Mickey Mouse getting up the ass or whatever. It's like whatever you want, you can do that drawing, and if people want to look at it, fine.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another strength that comics have that no one else has. Certainly not now. I think it's, like I say, I grew up in the 70s where there was a lot of transgressive imagery on TV, and it was like fantastic, and it formed my imagination. I'm sure also people like Alan Moore and Peter Milligan and others in our generation were drawing a lot on that stuff. But nowadays, I don't think there's that same level. So comics can still go there, you know, comics can still show you things and tell you things that I don't think you'll get anywhere else.
Totally. And it's funny that you mention sort of the period that you grew up in, like the drama that you were consuming, like the Des Potter and, you know, that era, the place for today, that era of sort of 60s, 70s, 80s Britain. Because I thought about this a lot when, like, we've had guests on, people like Mike Lee, the director, and, you know, who obviously created, you know, doing some of their best work in that period with like Nuts and May and Abigail's Party. But like, I feel like if you're of a certain age and if you're British, so if you were born in, say, the 50s or the 60s or the 70s, and you were growing up in that time, you know, which was a pretty turbulent time in a lot of ways, socially and politically, you would have seen some shit, really, you know, on television, because, you know, 3 or 4 channels, and then you would turn on, you get Culloden by Peter Watkins, or Abigail's Party, or Scum by Alan Clark, and I can't imagine the influence that, yeah, it would have just been straight into your living room. I can't really imagine, you know, it would have cut your head off, you know, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, and you can see Scum directly influencing the scene in Alan Moore's Miracle Man, where it's like, you know, Johnny Bates in the Reform School, and it's all there, you know, and you'll see something that's maybe I've referenced from Dennis Potter. So yeah, very much. I mean, my theory about that really is that what happened after the war was that the working class were allowed to speak for 40 years maybe before getting shut up
Educated.
again.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we were educated and we were, you know, raised at libraries, and I was lucky, you know. I lived in Glasgow. My parents were well read. They were very poor, but well read, you know. So we were encouraged to read, and we were encouraged to be into culture. But for me, what happened was working class was suddenly given a voice, and out of that, you get some of the greatest drama we've ever produced. You got all the best pop music. You got great comics. So I mean, I could go through. There's the great comedy. There was the working class suddenly got a chance to speak, and what they came out with was this torrent, this explosion of new culture. And over the decades, like, this rich kids started to notice how much fun we were having, and took it all back. So the pop stars now are rich kids. The artists now are rich kids. You know, the comic people. I mean, I'm not saying everyone. I'm sure there's still outlets, but that flow, that torrent, was kind of turned off. Once the working class had done all the work and provided all the pop songs and the comics and the films that then could be dissected and collaged over the next 40 years of culture, our work was done. There's no need for it, and it became the playground of Nepo babies again, and rich kids who suddenly go, well, I want to be in the charts. That looks like fun. But without that mad creativity, without that sense of having something to say that hadn't been allowed up until that moment, And I still find, I mean, I found that in my dealings with the BBC is like the minute they hear a Govan accent, you're doomed. Honestly, it's over. And they talk about they want to hear voices from the regions, but the minute they hear them, it's like, oh, too much. And so that's that type of material we are talking about, the material that is raw and edgy and scary and talking about stuff that's really going on, not just what the Sunday Times is talking about is going on,
Totally.
is has been kind of diminished and replaced because it's too much for people. It's like that, and Lost Girls is too much for a lot of people. It's like Dennis Potter, too much, me, too much. And it'll be too much in one way or another, but that's the basic worry. It's always too much for them. So I find that it's this working class culture has been provided so much because it was like a dam that was allowed to burst and all of this stuff exploded out of it. And then that access to culture was kind of turned off again.
Totally. And I mean, I'm from Sheffield, so, you're up in Buckinghamshire, and I live in London, so I can definitely attest to that sort of sense. If you're from the outside, you're from the outside, and there's a sense of privilege and sort of gatekeeping, and which does, I think, have a basis in class. And I think that, I think what the period that you're talking about, those 30, 40 years where working class people had more of a voice and were given an opportunity, I think, or took that opportunity to like influence the art and the pop music and the drama. And I think, like I said, I feel like it's a great part of that was the kind of the education system being more robust and like maybe like the 11 plus and grammar schools being more easily available, like, in post-war Britain, and then like that feeding it, like the Beatles. So, absolutely, all four of them, were all educated, smart, but incredibly working class, Scousers. They had that voice and that energy and that color, and it all feeds through into the work. And you're absolutely
And
right.
as you say, I mean, after post-war, the whole idea of educating the working class was very important. But now the last thing they need is an educated working class, so you don't get that now. They wanted educated people to do the jobs that they imagined would come in the post-war, and then suddenly automation and a lot of other things made every job more and more obsolete. So people didn't need to be educated anymore. But again, we grew up in a golden time where it was encouraged and libraries were encouraged, and you was intended to read and to understand politics. Working class people were shop stewards and union people. So I think a lot of that is drained away, and that the influence from that culture. I mean, I watch these things about the Glasgow shipbuilders and the way the shop stewards spoke, and it's like the way my father spoke is library card vocabulary. It's really funny. They love big words, but they use them in this ridiculous kind of very odd way with a heavy Glasgow accent. So I've kind of learned from those guys, but I love that oratory, and it's a very specific. I can tell that's from a generation of people who were sent to the library and who were taught basic English and taught to, speak well and speak even when they're obviously regional.
Totally. And I think there was also a sense of the autodidact in that. Like if you failed your 11 plus and you couldn't get into grammar school, you go and educate yourself, go to the library, and it's like, I guess you could say in today's sort of vernacular, it's the anti-brain rot or whatever. It's like, no, it's self-education and self-direction, and which is really, really important and still is, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, I would say it is, but I mean, I don't have to worry about the state of Britain right now. Hiding in the country.
Loving the Twin Peaks t-shirt, by the way. Is that
Oh,
Twin
yeah.
Peaks
So, and I'm always wearing this Twin Peaks t-shirt. Yeah, it's the atom bomb one.
Oh yeah, from the season 3, The Return.
Yeah, the return.
I mean, I feel like we've gone too long without mentioning your book, Supergods.
All right, well, let's get into that.
Because this really, just on a personal level, this book was a huge book for me, reading it as a teenager. I mean, like so many different ideas, and it just almost played that. It was almost like a download of information, all these names of people I hadn't heard of, like Terence McKenna and the Renaissance philosopher you mentioned, Pico, and all these things, those ideas. And like I've read this book and reread it many times over the years, and it almost reads like a kind of manifesto, for me anyway, of like a sort of a more positive, proactive future governed by the principles of the superhero that you outlined in the book. So these ideas that we talk about with Superman, the enlightened sort of ideal and the rational man, and how if we emphasize the best in us rather than the worst, we can that strains through into how we live, and that can make a sort of better, or potentially help make a better society. And I guess like I've reread this book many times over the years, and it's been nearly 15 years since it came out. Let's not linger on that too much. But like, do you think like it's a book that seemed to encompass, and you seemed like you were going after everything in that book. Like you were trying to tackle not just superheroes and also your own life, because I know a lot of that is your memoir as well. But like that felt to me like you were tackling kind of everything that you could, everything under the sun, strange through this prism of this sort of work class, also superheroic sort of view of the world. And I think now that we're nearly 15 years on from the book's release, what are your views today on the modern world? Like, post this book, I mean, do you feel like we're living closer to that sort of like almost being sucked into a kind of comic book reality of sort of like think that world is sort of edging closer to our world in a positive sense? Or do you think we're moving towards a more sort of negative, darker space and time? I mean, what do you think of, I guess what I'm saying is, what do you think of the world now? Big question.
Well, definitely the narrative that we're living through tells us that everything's getting worse, doesn't it? And it's very persuasive, but it's a collage of a lot of stuff, and it's designed to make us feel a certain way. So it's hard to trust whether people are actually feeling that way. I mean, I think generally people are the same as they always were. They just want things to be okay and to be able to pursue their own creativity and their own strange ideas. And most people aren't violent or want to get into conflict, but we continually choose to elect people who seem to define themselves through murder. So there is this, the problem is still with the sociopaths that we continually think have leadership qualities. But at the same time, the culture keeps feeding back the notion that sociopaths have leadership qualities. There's only books that will tell you this stuff. So we've been fed a certain worldview, and then that worldview is manifesting. So it is like what Pico has told us, and to me, the whole zombie culture thing we've been sold, I had the feeling that there's two visions of the future, and one's basically Star Trek, the original Gene Roddenberry Star Trek. Hey, we all get together and go out into space and make friends, and if we don't make friends, we'll phaser them, but never mind that part. But the idea is just basically, here's an international crew of characters from Earth, and Earth is lovely, and we've taken out this lovely liberal worldview. And then you had the Walking Dead, and it's like, no, this is the future. This is where it's all going. The resource collapse, whatever the Walking Dead are, that's us. And looking at it, to me, that zombie thing, which became very big, that image of the zombie kind of took over from the superhero, the progressive notion, the Star Trek figure, the astronaut. It was the zombie, was this image of humans. But to me, that's actually just billionaires' fear of the masses, and we've been sold it. We've been repeatedly hypnotized with the billionaires' nightmares, where they wake up sweating and it's all these emaciated figures clambering up the wall of the compound. And it's all the people they've impoverished and starved. That's their nightmare. It's not our nightmare, but we've been fed their nightmare to the point where it's like, is this the way the world's going? Is this the way the world's going? Well, yeah, and that's the way it is in their heads, and almost they're trying to create that. Even if it's just through fear, they'll create the thing they fear. So I think we have to be aware of the narrative we're getting. And again, it's hard for me. I grew up in a very simple Cold War world where, surveillance is bad, the prisoner is, and the individual is the most important thing. And I don't necessarily agree with that. And I certainly don't live in a world where privacy or anything matters anymore, or is a thing. So that to me is strange. And the complexities of it have just become fractioned out in ways that to me just like, I can't argue that position, because that opposite position is exactly true also, and will be defended by as many people as so. Having opinions, having ideas like that just seemed to no longer suit the taste and tenor of the modern world at all. But the way I see it, it's telling itself a story and then living up to it. And it's like the Invisibles, when the Invisibles, for the billionaires, are sacrificing children, just like the Aztecs, because the dark gods feed on anguish. That could just be as true. These people might be eyes wide shut with Cthulhu. And yet all of this is being done to feed the gods, to give them strength to break through and take over the world and enslave us all.
Yeah.
All of these, we can tell any mad story about this, but the narrative right now is that we're fucking up and that everything's going wrong, and somehow it can only lead in disaster. And the idea that they're even talking about conscription or World War III constantly in the papers is bugging the tits out of me as well, because I just think, get out of here. But you're trying to create conditions, you're trying to create a certain ambience of fear and the chance of disaster occurring at all times to keep everybody anxious. So again, I don't even know the input from the world outside is real or true anymore. So I can only form strange collages of what I've experienced in the past and how it worked before. But there's too many stories. But yeah, the main story is negative right now. And I think, as you say, bringing it back to Supergods, I was trying to emphasize again, here's the kind of the last shred of the positive future we've got. The superhuman, the super people that are showing up in all these films are getting closer and closer to the real world. They came up from comics and 2 dimensions and paper and ink, and they made it through to CGI and special effects and millions of people watching them, billions even watching them. And I thought, well, the next stage of that is for us to become them. Come on, you know. And so that's why I was always thought it was important to emphasize superhero morality as well, and why Batman shouldn't kill, you know, because Batman kills, then he's just the Joker. He's not in a costume killing people that he doesn't like. But is a superhero because of this weird stance he takes. Superman is a superhero because, no, I won't kill people. I'll think of some other way of doing it. I'll use my imagination. And I think they should all have, some characters should be the Punisher. All those, yeah, you can have some characters that kill, or Marvel Man to make it more realistic. But I think the basic superhero concept is a morality that's beyond us, but worth striving for and always worth aiming at. You know, just like the idea of Christ and the messages of Christ. It's really hard for a normal human being to achieve any of that or all of that, but certainly worth pursuing and worth trying, because it kind of makes life a bit better, you know, to not have a lot of conflict and to have friends and to do stuff like that, to be a super person rather than a super villain.
Totally. And I think that was what was so powerful about the book to me when I first read it, when it came out, was the fact that, like, as a kid growing up in the noughties and into the 2010s and that post 9/11, you know, in the West, and how they're, you know, the central question, I think, in the media, I mean, now it's like, yeah, when's conscription going to come in? When's World War III going to come up, was to say, but then it was like, when's the next bomb going to go off? When's the next, you know, 9/11 going to happen? And like, I'm growing up in that time, you know, the media, the media still had a bit more of a monolithic presence, I think, in our lives there. Now it's totally fragmented, or even more fragmented. It was beginning then, but I think in the last 25 years, it really just feels like that narrative that you talk about, that sort of negative zombie narrative, has really come to the fore. And as a kid who was kind of growing up in that world, I really felt that. And so I kind of clung to things like this book, like Supergods, because as a sort of, I guess, sort of optimistic, hopeful kid, I was kind of looking for the kind of and that was why the book was so important. It was like someone reaching out. I mean, it was you, and just like, this is, hold on, that's only one way of looking at the world. You know, there's so much more going on in, you know, you talk about the 5th dimension and how that is almost human. That is human imagination. The human head is so much bigger and stranger and more complicated, and is capable of so much more than we're giving it credit for. And that's what was so inspiring about the book. It was like, you know, there's so many other ways to do this. And like the monolithic aspect of, I guess, the world and that narrative. You know, it's like when you described the bomb. Right? It's like when you were a kid, you grew up so close to where the American nuclear submarines were stationed, and how bomb was a terrifying idea, but Superman was a better, stronger, faster idea. And that was an incredibly inspiring thing to me. And I think it really carries through from like that time when you were a kid right through till now. And I think it's really important to emphasize these more optimistic narratives, just as better ideas, as counter ideas and narratives, which can defeat, if you like, if you want to use that jargon, defeat those kind of narratives.
Definitely, I think it's almost imperative, you know. And I felt it was on the verge of punk rock just to be optimistic and to say, okay, don't always feel what you tell me I should be feeling. You know, I think there are maybe other ways. And obviously, again, it's what people focus on. It's what the narrative is. It's as easy to focus on scientific discoveries. I mean, we're reaching out further into the universe and discovering further into the past than ever before. And, you know, people are seeing things that have never been seen. We've sent out probes that are going faster and further and photographing planets. There's some immense discoveries being made in science and in medicine, and in art, and things are happening that people don't talk about. And even in the West, you know, the atmosphere in the Eastern countries is very different from here, and there's a sense of renewal and a rising, and a facing the 21st century and having ideas and opinions that are forward looking. seen from that perspective. So it's only we feel kind of decadent under the weather. I think, again, it's scared people are telling us to feel scared like them, when in actual fact it's not necessarily us. I mean, we are threatened by them. I'm still living on that same loch where the nuclear subs go up and down. So honestly, I'm number one target in Britain. It's me and what that other place in London. So yeah, I mean, that it's right here. You know, Superman. Yeah, he's a better idea than the bomb. So I'm hoping he's a better idea if anything gets worse around here. Yeah, I mean, it's real and we're living it. But what else we got? If we don't emphasize the good stuff, we don't pursue the mad and the positive and see if it works and see if it's better and see if it makes us feel better or feels other people better, then kind of what have we got? You know, it's like, and some people might just say, oh, it was nihilism, and that's fine. But as I said, magic counters nihilism because magic always finds meaning, and so people always find meaning in things, even in nihilism. So I say, like, when you tell me the universe is utterly meaningless, and there's no meaning in anything, and it's just a churn of particles, and then, but how come everywhere we look, we find meaning everywhere? Even we look at a bee dead in the ground, we find meaning. We look at a glass, we find meaning. So where's that coming from? And if it's coming from us, then we're the meaning generators in this fabulous universe. Should we be doing some more cool stuff? So it is kind of, there's nihilism and then beyond that. Nah, because that's, you know, that's easily countered by the world isn't like that, because everywhere we look, we see that it's not like that. We imbue meaning in everything, even if the meaning is that it's hopeless, it's awful. People write entire books about how hopeless and awful it is. You know, that's how much meaning is imbued even in nihilism. So I think meaning wins in the end. But what we're actually approaching is a technological reality of that people are getting close to putting something, contacting kids' brains that will allow them to create a telepathic net. And once there's a telepathic net, they're exchanging thought, and they're exchanging thought with AI at the same time. When we come out, there's this little guy just coming down the street and he platform shooting. He looks like he'd come from the 70s of this whole thing. He's going, I've just painted Barbados, I have. And it was like, yeah, no way. He goes, you fucking Tory bastards. But yeah, you know, I'm doing this Batman Deadpool thing, so it's the only comic I agreed to do in the last few years. And they said, do you want to do this Batman Deadpool? And I said, yeah, sure, I've got to do this.